found out, and what is most significant about the whole story with the Manafort arrest and the Mueller investigation?
So Robert Mueller has been systematically trying to build a case that gets to the center of whatever the scandal is about Russian influence, Russian collusion with the Trump campaign in this last election. And so we see that he's gone for the central figure in the campaign, which was Paul Manafort, who was in charge of the campaign for 5 extremely important months. And he had the indictment that he filed against Manafort isn't about the election, it's not about the campaign, it's about Manafort's involvement in Ukraine, essentially, and about the money that he received for his work for the Party of Regions and for other interests in Ukraine, and the way in which it was illegally laundered into the United States. And so he's attacked Manafort. He's shown that Manafort himself is extremely vulnerable to prosecution. And the question is, where does this lead? You know, how is he able to use this information, to use this devastating indictment of Manafort in order to get more information that gets us closer to the center of the narrative of the election?
And what new have we found from that indictment and from the whole story?
Right, so we know...
it was not a surprise for us that Manafort was dealing with Yanukovych.
No, of course, but it's one thing to suspect somebody of laundering money and to suspect that they were avoiding taxes, to suspect that they were operating through shell companies, and we knew that, but we didn't know the scale, that there was $75 million that he was laundering, that he had in these secretive accounts that we've been able to account for. And we didn't know that he was technically guilty of breaking the law. And so that's the most important thing, that he seems like he's technically guilty of breaking not just one law, but a whole series of violations that make him extremely vulnerable.
How much do we know about the real involvement of Manafort into Yanukovych activities?
Right.
What can we really prove? Because, a consultant, it could be different things. So how engaged? What
Right.
do you know?
So this indictment didn't really reveal a whole lot about Manafort's place within the Yanukovych universe, but we don't need to know too much more than is already established in the public record, which was that he became a central advisor to Yanukovych following the Orange Revolution, when Yanukovych was trying to reinvent himself as a politician, that Manafort was the chief architect of that reinvention. And then when Yanukovych was president, I've talked to a lot of Party of Regions insiders who describe how Yanukovych only listened to Manafort at certain periods of time. I mean, he listened to members of his own family, but when people within the Party of Regions wanted to make an argument to Yanukovych to convince him, they oftentimes had to go through Manafort in order to get Yanukovych to pay attention, because Manafort knew the language that could make Yanukovych understand a position. We know that in the debate over the European Union, Manafort was intensely involved and was trying to. He claims he was trying to convince Yanukovych to sign the accession agreement, and it's obvious that he was spending a lot of time there in the run-up to the revolution. We don't know about what Manafort's role was in the revolution itself, what he was telling Yanukovych, and then certainly after the revolution, he kept coming back to Ukraine. He kept trying to recreate this opposition bloc party that it seems like there were leaders of the Party of Regions who were trying to reinvent themselves yet again, who were relying extremely heavily on Manafort. In the indictment, it says, I think it was more than a dozen trips that he made back to Ukraine after the Maidan. Look, I think that for Ukraine, I think the significance of Manafort is incredibly obvious in terms of being an accomplice of a regime that stole so much money from the country, that was ultimately responsible for murder. So that's obvious. But Manafort in the United States is such an important such an important character in Washington. He was so important to changing the nature of political consulting, of lobbying, and really of politics in this country, where there were things that weren't acceptable that Manafort made acceptable. So it wasn't acceptable to have foreign dictators as your clients, but Manafort showed how you can make a lot of money doing that. It wasn't acceptable. Before Manafort, there was no firm that was helping candidates get elected and then lobbying them after they get elected, which is it's a kind of a conflict of interest and a very dangerous business, and Manafort created that business. And so he's somebody who just was always changing the rules and making the system, more accepting of less ethical behavior.
What do we expect else from the Mueller investigation? I understand I'm not about the speculation, but really how you also speak about these kind of things, the criticism to Mueller investigation, which is there on a lot of other media, even the ones like the Wall Street Journal, because I'm also asking that because if you're outside of the States, it seems like what a big story.
Yes.
Soon, something would happen big.
Well, so the biggest danger to me, and the thing that could kind of throw us into the middle of a major political crisis, is if Trump was to fire Robert Mueller, which is an entirely possible thing to do given his track record of firing James Comey and for complaining on Twitter about Robert Mueller. And you can imagine it happening, that he decided that so he was getting close to being prosecuted, and you could imagine that he would fire him. And I know that sounds maybe like not necessarily the most plausible scenario at this moment, but it is a plausible scenario. And if it were to happen, it would be an extremely large test of the Republican Party to see how they would respond, because this process was set up to be outside of politics, to be outside of the bureaucracy, to be a process that was very, very legalistic. And if Trump were to intervene for his own personal preservation, it would be among the greatest political crimes in American history.